Well, thanks so much, Eric. After graduating from Harvard Law School and briefly working in the law, Tom Cotton enlisted in the U.S. Army in 2005. He was deployed to Iraq and then to Afghanistan, and before completing his military service, he was awarded a Bronze Star and 2 Army Commendation Medals. In 2013, at the age of 36, he was elected to the House of Representatives, and since 2015 has served as a United States Senator from Arkansas. Senator Cotton, welcome to the Jewish Leadership Conference's 2021 Conference on Jews and Conservatism.
Thank you, John. Good to be on with you.
Elliott Abrams is Senior Fellow for Middle Eastern Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. After serving in President Reagan's State Department, he went on to serve as Deputy National Security Advisor to President George W. Bush, and then most recently as Special Representative for Iran and Venezuela for Secretary Pompeo in the Trump administration. I should also say that he serves on the board of our main conference sponsor today, the Tikva Fund, and when not employed in government service, he's been extremely active in writing defining essays on the Middle East for us at Mosaic, as well as teaching in advanced Tikva educational programs for graduate students and mid-career professionals. Elliott, welcome back to the Jewish Leadership Conference.
Thanks very much, John. Glad to be back.
Gentlemen, our task today is to discuss the threat from Iran and America's strategy to counter it. Now, to begin to dimension that threat, Senator Cotton, I'd like to ask you to just set the table for us and summarize the different kind of threats that you see, from nuclear proliferation to terror financing, that Iran represents for the regional order and for American allies and interests in the Middle East. How does Iran threaten the United States?
Sure, John. Obviously, for the last 10 years, much of the focus has been on a nuclear weapon getting in the hands of the Ayatollahs, and that would obviously be catastrophic. But I think rather than look at the nature of the weapons, we should look at the nature of the regime of Iran. It is a fanatical anti-American regime. It has been for more than 40 years. It started out calling us the Great Satan and chanting death to America, and it still does that today. It's sponsored terrorism throughout the region, across the world, really. It's directly responsible for the deaths of more than 600 Americans in Iraq and in Afghanistan. And that's why we always have to be very clear-eyed about the threat in dealing with the Ayatollahs, who have shown themselves to be malign, duplicitous fanatics. Now, obviously, the threat from Iran is not like the threat from China. We're not at risk of being displaced as the world's economic or military superpower by Iran. But in some ways, Iran is more aggressive and it destabilizes our interest even more than a peer competitor like China. As I said, they pose a direct threat to and taking the lives of thousands of Americans, whether it's our service members in Iraq and Afghanistan or the victims of Iranian terror going back 4 decades. That also destabilizes one of the world's already dangerous and unstable corners, where we have critical allies like Israel, and at a time when Israel is making peace with many of its Arab neighbors, Iran is working to destabilize that. And they do that not just through their pursuit of a nuclear weapon, but through their drive for sufficient missile forces to hold all of its neighbors at risk, to hold American interest and troops and citizens at risk as well. They use terror financing to try to destabilize the region. They work through proxies like the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq or the Houthi rebels in Yemen or Hezbollah and so forth. So there are multiple different avenues in which Iran threatens our interests and threatens our allies and threatens peace and stability in the Middle East.
Elliott, I'd like to go back in time to January 19th, 2021, so that we can try to think creatively about what might be done to counter those threats by first understanding what we have done up until now. The day before President Biden was inaugurated, what was the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign? How did it work? What effects was it having then on Iran when it was in full force?
There were a couple of parts to it. One of them was the economic part, the economic sanctions. And remember, we didn't have 4 years of heavy economic sanctions. They didn't start on January 20th, 2017. They started about a couple of years after that, and they were cumulative. So In really 2 years of heavy sanctions, we deprived Iran of tens of billions of dollars of investments and revenue for the government, oil and gas revenue. And we know what they would have done with that money because the Obama administration, you remember the pallets of cash, gave them billions of dollars under the theory that they'd spend it on the people of Iran, but they spent a lot of it on Hezbollah, the groups that the senator mentioned, the Houthis, Hamas, and the Shia militias in Iraq, and building up their own military forces. So depriving them of that money was a great achievement. And the sanctions were continuing. Actually, they continue to this day. They've not been lifted. I would say one other thing, which is that we sent a message to Iran, particularly in the last 6 months of the administration, that we were not going to tolerate the killing of Americans. As Senator Cotton said, Iran has killed an awful lot of Americans over the decades, essentially with immunity from any American reaction. You will remember the USS Nimitz being in the Gulf and those B-52 flights. Those were combined with messages that the administration sent to Iran saying that if Americans were killed in Iraq, we were not going to punish a Shia militia, which was merely an Iranian proxy. The punishment would hit Iran itself, and it was an effective deterrent.
Well, a great many of the Americans that Iran has targeted were targeted by Qasem Soleimani. So of course, the main tool of American pressure, as you say, Elliott, was economic sanctions. But it's not like the United States didn't also take kinetic military action at certain points. Senator Cotton, you sit on the Senate Intelligence Committee, so I'm sure there's much that you can't tell us. But what can you tell us about the Soleimani operation and its consequences?
Well, Qasem Soleimani was irreplaceable in Iran and to the supreme leader. He was battle-tested in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. He had a decades-long, close, personal, trusted relationship with the supreme leader. He rose through the ranks to be the head of the Quds Force and the IRGC. To give you a sense of what that would mean in our system, it'd be kind of as if you combined our CIA and our Special Operations Command, both intelligence gathering and Special Operations military forces. And over the last 15 years, Qasem Soleimani had cultivated a wide and very loyal following throughout the Middle East of these proxy groups and terrorist organizations. In fact, over time in the Obama era, he had grown so bold that he abandoned the extreme operational security he had used during the Bush era of, moving in the dark of night, moving under multiple vehicles, making different kinds of cutouts to avoid an American airstrike. By the end of the Obama era, he was openly popping up on social media across the Middle East, inspiring his followers and Iran's proxies, thumbing his nose in America's face. That I can post on social media when I'm traipsing about in Syria or in Lebanon, rallying the troops and celebrating them. But that all came to an end a year ago, and it was well past time that Qasem Soleimani was killed for the thousands of Americans whose lives he had shattered. And it has significantly set back Iran's terror operation and their ability to plan large, complex operations. It obviously hasn't stopped it, but he really was irreplaceable in the number of relationships he had built throughout the region, in the charismatic personality he cut through Iran's proxies and the way he inspired them. They have not been able to replace him yet. I'm not sure they ever will be able to replace him. That doesn't mean that Iran is not dangerous, but it was a huge blow to Iran and a great victory for America and Israel and our Arab nations and anyone who supports peace and stability in the world, and frankly, who supports justice as well.
Well, you mentioned that though Qasem Soleimani has been cannot be replaced. Nevertheless, Iran has not stopped. And indeed, even in these first months of the Biden administration, Iran seems to be testing what America can abide and what our limits are. What do you think the Iranians want, Senator Cotton? And what do you think the Biden administration wants?
Well, as Elliott pointed out, they didn't test our resolve very much after Qasem Soleimani was killed. And as Elliott said, there were many public gestures to make it just clear how resolved we were. Elliott did mention one of the president's social media posts towards the end of his tenure, in which he gave friendly advice to Iran about what would happen if an American were killed. They didn't test our resolve because we had demonstrated our resolve. And unfortunately, the early days of the Biden administration, in my opinion, have showed irresolution. You can just look at the steps that the Biden administration has taken that shows that they're desperate to get back into negotiations with Iran. They pressured the European Union to scrap a resolution of censure about Iran not cooperating with nuclear inspections. They're in the process of allowing South Korea to unfreeze more than $1 billion of Iranian funds. They rescinded the Trump's administration's determination that so-called snapback sanctions had gone into effect. They revoked the terror designation of the Houthi rebel group in Yemen. They froze arms sales to countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, arms sales that we want to make in part to help countries in the region be more self-reliant, self-sufficient. They've made it clear time and time again that they are so eager to get back into negotiations. I mean, yes, a couple of weeks ago, we did strike a militia in Syria, though, not in Iraq. And we did so in a way that, frankly, didn't do much damage to their war-making capability. It reminds me a little bit about what Bill Clinton did to al-Qaeda in 1998 in Sudan or Afghanistan, or maybe what I should say he didn't do, largely blowing up some huts or some tents. And you just look at what you see from the Pentagon every day. John Kirby, the Pentagon chief spokesman, a career military man who knows better, he's not some political operative, calls these militias in Iraq Shia-backed militias. So he would rather slander an entire branch of the Islamic faith than call them what they are, Iranian-backed militias, because they think it's too provocative or would set back the efforts to get back into negotiations. Iran sees these signals of weakness, and I think we can only expect them to continue to take more aggressive action, to target our troops and our contractors and citizens throughout the region, to see the Houthis target Saudi Arabia or UAE's oil infrastructure, as just happened last week. It's a very volatile mix because weakness is provocative, especially in the Middle East.
Elliott, do you see it the same way?
I think actually I do see it pretty much the same way. And I think the people in the administration are, maybe this is too strong a word, but I think they're kind of bewildered. I think they genuinely thought it would be possible in a month or two to get back to the JCPOA and restore the kind of relationship with Iran that existed in the Obama administration. But it's not possible. I mean, we're already seeing that. And as Tom said, you know, look what happened in Yemen. The reaction to reversing the designation of the Houthis as a terrorist group is that the Houthis do more and more attacks on Saudi Arabia. So I don't think the administration quite knows what its next move is going to be. And there is a real fallacy at the center of their policy, in my opinion. Because what they say is, look, we're going to go back to the JCPOA, but that's not enough. Then we want longer and stronger. We want to extend the sunsets. We want to talk about Iranian missiles. We want to talk about their support for terrorism in the region. But if we go back to the JCPOA, that means we lift most of the economic sanctions and we eliminate the leverage that we have on Iran. They don't want to stop building missiles. They don't want to stop supporting Hezbollah and these Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and the Houthis and so on. So only very, very powerful pressure will get them to do it. But the administration is on a road that would have them eliminate that pressure. It lacks logic at its center.
Okay, so both the Obama administration and the Biden administration, each in their own way, believes that the JCPOA is compatible with the long-standing American promise promised by president after president to solemnly declare that the United States will not permit the world's most dangerous sponsor of terror to acquire a nuclear weapon. The Biden administration seems to believe that the JCPOA is a way to affect that promise. Both of you are skeptical about it. So, Elliott, where does that lead you?
Well, I'd like to see the president say that we will never permit Iran to get a nuclear weapon and that we will act to prevent it if need be. I believe candidate Biden said that, but it's different if the president says it. I think it's really important for the United States to make it clear that Iran may go down that road, but they will never reach the end of it. We will try to prevent it through pressure and sanctions. And if that doesn't work, the culmination of it is still going to be nothing. We are not going to permit Iran to get a nuclear weapon. I'd like to hear that from the President, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, now.
Senator Cotton, what can you do? The Republicans do not control the Senate, but what can you do as a senator, and what can your colleagues do to support that?
Well, Republicans may not control the Senate, but it's fair to say that Iran hawks do control it. Remember, when the Iran nuclear deal was put up for a vote 6 years ago, a majority opposed it, to include the Senate Majority Leader now, Chuck Schumer, as well as Bob Menendez, the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. What we can do is continue to highlight what Elliott and I have discussed, the actions that Iran has taken just in the last 6 weeks under Joe Biden's tenure, and how dangerous it would be to relax the sanctions that Elliott cited, to give them a hand up off of the mat as opposed to trying to drive them down into the mat and ultimately into submission, into not just giving up their ambitions for nuclear weapons, but giving up their reign of terror across the Middle East and around the world and their missile program. They need none of those things for their own security. They only have to act like a normal state if they want to be treated like a normal state. There is a large and bipartisan majority in the Congress to do those things. And in fact, it was a large bipartisan majority in the Congress before I even got there in the early Obama years that imposed the sanctions that finally drove Iran to start negotiating in the later Obama years.
Of course, when we're thinking about this strategic question, we're not only thinking about the United States and the President and the Senate and Iran, we're thinking about an entire region, a region which has recently experienced titanic shifts in the alliances that contour its politics. Elliott, what do you think the Abraham Accords mean for Iran, and how do the Iranians interpret it?
I don't think there would be Abraham Accords if it weren't for this conduct on the part of Iran. The central binding factor for the Abraham Accords is really Iran. Obviously, the Arab states are attracted, the Emirates, Bahrain, all the others, attracted by the enormous success of Israel, the economic success, the technological success, scientific success, military success. But that's the pull factor. There's an equal or maybe even larger push factor, and that is their fear of Iran and their understanding that there's only one country that is really capable in that region of resisting Iran. You know, they're all over. They're directly attacking Saudi Arabia. Iranian proxies are in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen. But the Iranians are afraid of Israel. And so for the Gulf Arabs and other Sunni Arab states, Israel is the absolutely essential ally.
That's the question I want to put to you too, Senator Cotton. Among the first actions that the Biden administration took in the Middle East was to put Saudi Arabia on notice, reviewing our relationship with the Saudis while at the same time withdrawing American support for their proxy war with Iran in Yemen. It seems to me that one could interpret that as a sign of danger for the American commitment to the Abraham Accords, What can the Senate do to strengthen them, even if the Biden administration were to prioritize outreach to Iran and renewing the JCPOA over our allies in the Middle East?
Well, I hope they won't do that. I hope, for instance, that the Biden administration will reauthorize and move forward with some of the foreign military sales that were part of the Abraham Accords to, say, the UAE or to Bahrain. Again, a main purpose of those foreign military sales is to help our Gulf partners be able to defend themselves along with Israel. So it requires less constant military commitment from the United States. So it's counterproductive to halt those sales. That's something that I think, again, you have a support in the Congress from the majority of the Congress for those accords and for fulfilling our commitments underneath them to ensure that they remain a kind of new linchpin of our security structure in the Middle East. It's highly commendable of President Trump that he was able to bring those accords to a conclusion. Elliott's right, though, that they were preceded by many years of more quiet cooperation kind of behind the scenes between Israel and many of the Arab nations. But to bring them out in the open into a formal peace agreement was just an incredible accomplishment. And we need to do everything that we can to preserve that accomplishment because it's so vital to our own security interests in the region that we have all of our partners, whether it's Israel or the UAE or Saudi Arabia or any other Arab nation, cooperating together against what is our most severe shared threat in the region, which is Iran.
There's another crucial threat, a crucial factor when thinking about the Middle East. You've already alluded to it, Senator Cotton. It's an arena, the Middle East is an arena of conflict between states and terrorist organizations, but it's also an arena of proxy competition between China and the West. Now, Presidents Obama, Trump, and Biden, in one of the few continuities between those administrations, all want American foreign policy to pivot to the Asia-Pacific theater. How do you think the American confrontation with Iran relates to our posture vis-a-vis China?
Well, I would, John, draw a distinction between pivoting from regions or theaters and pivoting to threats. China is the most serious long-term threat we face, a security threat to our prosperity, a threat to our freedom. And that's a threat that is worldwide, and we have to counteract it worldwide, not just abroad, but here at home in terms of dealing with the theft of our property and stealing of our jobs and factories and shutting down Chinese influence on our campuses and so forth. But the Middle East is another area of competition with China. China's main objectives there are trying to secure its oil that it needs for its economy and trade routes to the Middle East and Africa and Europe, but also getting new markets for their continued economic growth. For the longest time, the United States Navy has been able to hold at risk all of China's sea lines west of the Strait of Malacca. But the Chinese Communist Party has been investing in a string of bases and ports from Sri Lanka to Djibouti and points in between to try to secure all that. They've also invested in the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, which is kind of a neo-colonial debt diplomacy strategy to become the dominant power in South Asia and the Middle East, in Africa, especially the Horn of Africa. And that means that they'll have an increased presence there, and they want to cooperate with friendly nations there. And Iran is going to be typically more friendly towards its fellow authoritarian government than certainly countries like Israel would be, or relatively liberal Arab nations like the United Arab Emirates. So China, I don't think, will play a productive role in the Middle East because they will support Iran over many of our allies, and they will certainly work to undermine our interests in the region.
And Elliott, how do you see the tension between the United States and China playing out in the Middle East?
Well, we certainly hope that it doesn't bring more and more Chinese support for Iran. Senator Cotton mentioned at the beginning that they are siding with Iran on these nuclear questions. For example, in Vienna, at the IAEA, the Europeans backed away from a resolution condemning Iran for all of its violations now. It's violating not only the JCPOA, but the Non-Proliferation Treaty. why'd they back away? Because of Russia and China. Had they supported a resolution, we would have gotten it through the board. I think the attraction of the Chinese market is obvious for nations in the Middle East. I think they need to be very careful about getting ensnared in the kinds of nets that the senator mentioned, including Israel. You know, Israel is one of the high-tech champions of the world, despite its small size. It's got plenty of things the Chinese want. But in this 21st century struggle between the US and China, there's no question which side Israel is on and has to be on. So I think they need to actually be very careful in ways that sometimes over the decades they have not been, to keep China at a distance.
Well, Senator Cotton, let me ask you another question about Israel. The Obama administration's view of the Middle East, it seemed to me, had the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians right at the conceptual center. President Obama and Secretary Clinton and Secretary Kerry all seem to believe that you could solve the tensions, if you could solve the tensions between Israelis and Palestinians, then other regional tensions would be easier to solve too. It seems to me that the last years have shown that to be a conceptual error. Now the Biden administration has said that it's committed to a two-state solution. What's your view?
I'm reminded of the old high school point whenever someone on the losing end of a basketball or football game smarted off to his opponent, and the simple retort was to say scoreboard. Look at the scoreboard over the last 4 years at what the Trump administration accomplished in the Middle East after people like John Kerry said you can never, ever, 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 ever have any kind of peace agreement in the Middle East between Israel and Arab nations without resolving the Palestinian question first. And of course, that's exactly what Donald Trump helped midwife into being last year with the Abraham Accords. Look at the level of cooperation we've seen between Israel and the Arab nations, not just with whom they now have open peace agreements, but with other nations as well. I mean, the Saudis are not part of the Abraham Accords yet, but obviously they couldn't have occurred. Those overflights, for that matter, that were so symbolic of the Accords couldn't have occurred without Saudi assent. And when you talk to Arab leaders, or when you simply watched what they said, for instance, at the UN General Assembly, you saw that the Palestinian question over time continued to decline and is an important priority for them. Some of that, of course, is due to Iran's behavior, and there's nothing that can focus a nation on its own security and its need for alliances like a mortal threat that Iran poses to some of these Arab nations. But it's a reminder that these nations are not focused or obsessed on the Palestinian question the way so many liberal Democrats in Washington are. Now, that said, I'd like to see Israel and the Palestinians be able to resolve these questions. Ultimately, though, that's going to be a matter for their leaders and their choices. And the United States should not be putting pressure on Israel. It should not do as Barack Obama said early in his administration, trying to find daylight between Israel and the United States. If we've learned anything from the last 4 years, the cause of peace, stability, and security is advanced in the Middle East when Israel and every other nation in the Middle East understands that there is no daylight between Washington and Jerusalem.
Elliott, what do you see with the Palestinians now?
Well, you know, they're theoretically going to have an election in a few months. It's highly theoretical because we've heard that, I don't know, 5 times before. There hasn't been an election since 2006. The split between Fatah and Hamas, I think, is very deep. And though they're attempting right now to patch it over, I think that will fail. I also think, and I've had this view really since the Bush administration, I don't see how you get to a two-state solution. I don't myself think that a two-state solution is possible, taking into account Israeli security. So I don't myself think that pushing and using lots of American diplomatic and political energy to get a two-state solution now is really a useful thing for the United States to do. If you think of the Gaza and West Bank split, if you think of the condition of Palestinian politics, I think what we should be focusing on, and here the Abraham Accords can be quite useful, is improving the lives of West Bank Palestinians in particular. Not much can be done about Gaza in the hands of Hamas. But if Arab states are interested in helping in the West Bank, so that, for example, the unemployment rate is down, there's more investment. You're talking about a population that speaks English, which is very useful. I think that's the way to go. And that's the way practically to help Palestinians not to indulge in continuing fantasies about a two-state solution.
Let me ask each of you about the role that human rights should play in American foreign policy. Elliott, in the Reagan and Bush administrations, you were one of the most articulate and clear-eyed exponents of both the challenges of democracy promotion and human rights, but also, despite those challenges, why America must nevertheless champion human rights. It seems to me like the Republican Party's changed some on that question. Elliott, first, you think it has, and where do you think it's headed?
I think it has somewhat. I haven't. I still think that the support for human rights, for liberty, for democracy, for free elections, is a huge asset for the United States. The hard question, and we've had this at least since the Reagan administration, is how do you balance that off against our other interests, security interests, financial, commercial? Because a government is not an NGO. An NGO has the ability to just be for human rights 100% of the time, no balancing, no other considerations. A government can't do that. We see that in the case of Saudi Arabia now, where the Biden administration is at least trying to balance off the Khashoggi case with our obvious security and commercial interests and the interests of our friends and partners and allies in the region in Saudi Arabia. So I think what's critical is that we need to make our views clear. Our views of, for example, what the Chinese are doing in Xinjiang to the Uyghurs. Our views of what Putin has done in trying to kill and now imprisoning Alexei Navalny. Should we break relations? No. Should we say, well, no American official will ever talk to Xi Jinping or Putin? No, that is not in our national interest. But I think that what's critical is making it very clear that in the case of Iran or the case of Russia or China, we're not on the side of the regime. We're on the side of the people.
Senator Cotton, how do you think about the trade-offs between Americans standing for human rights, our financial and commercial interests, our security interests, and all else?
Well, I agree with what Elliott said. The promotion of the natural rights of all mankind and democratic self-government has long been a priority in America's foreign policy, and it should remain a priority. It's not only the morally right thing to do, it's the strategically sound thing to do. If you read memoirs of someone like Bob Gates and the times he had to sit down to negotiate with Soviet counterparts, the Russians always hated it. They despised it whenever America would bring up questions about the rights of religious or ethnic minorities or political dissidents inside of Russia. It was a major strategic advantage we had over Russia during the Cold War. Likewise today, China will consistently try to take off the table, even for negotiations or simply discussion, questions about what they consider to be quote-unquote internal matters, say Taiwan or Hong Kong, or religious and ethnic minorities in Xinjiang province, because they want to cordon those off so it can't even be discussed. They're happy to talk about climate change with John Kerry or trade policy and so forth, but they don't want to talk about those most sensitive issues to them because they know it puts them on the wrong foot from the very beginning. So not only is it the morally right thing to do, it's the strategically sound thing to continue to put the protection of natural rights and the promotion of democracy at the forefront of our diplomacy. Now, I do want to distinguish somewhat between those two things, and it's not a distinction that comes naturally to Americans or most Westerners, because we see them go hand in hand in our way of life, and that's been the case since our Constitution was adopted. But in many places around the world, they have neither. They have neither the protection of individual rights nor democracy. But in some places, and in some places across history, you see the two distinguished. You might say we have a constitutional democracy, and constitutionalism and democracy are slightly different concepts. Constitutionalism talks about a lot of those institutions and rights that we kind of take for granted, things like the rule of law, or an independent judiciary and independent impartial prosecutors, the rights to due process in court or when detained, rights of property, rights of freedom of speech and religion, expression, so on and so forth. Sometimes it can be easier to promote the development of those institutions, and they can be longer lasting and more stable institutions than simply having a democratic election. Too often throughout history, you see democratic elections occur, but then countries pretty quickly slide back into authoritarianism and ultimately dictatorship. So ultimately, the two are central pillars of our foreign policy. But I would say that the promotion of the institutions of freedom oftentimes provide a very needful precondition for democracy promotion.
Gentlemen, for this ranging conversation, which brought us on a tour from Yemen to Israel, from Tehran to Saudi Arabia, we've thought together about targeted assassinations and the natural rights of mankind. Elliott Abrams, Senator Cotton, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you, John.